Welcome to FTB Fridays for the 22nd of January, 2021. I am Jason C. McLean. It's 9:39 in the morning on Friday, so you know when we're recording it. And just a few days ago, there was a story that broke on, it broke everywhere, but we covered it on Forget the Box too. Uh, over the weekend on Sunday, a homeless man named Raphael Andre, his body was found in a portable toilet right near a homeless shelter that was forced to not let people stay over due to the curfew and the pandemic. And all the opposition parties in the National Assembly called on Premier François Legault to give an exemption to the homeless. And so did Valerie Plante. And Legault said absolutely not. And his reasoning was that people would just pretend to be homeless. Now, welcome my guest today, artist, activist, and FTB contributor Samantha Gold. First of all, welcome.
Hi.
Hi. Now, is Legault just out of touch, or does he just not care as long as his agenda comes in?
Can we say both? Because
Maybe.
you know when it comes to sort of politics in Quebec, you know that a Quebec leader has, if you'll pardon my language, screwed up when the federal government is telling a Quebec leader to have a little humanity. And I believe it was federal Indigenous minister who said that Legault's remarks were insensitive. First off, and I think I speak for everyone when I say that the whole argument that if I give one group an exception or one person an exemption, that really doesn't work when you are making excuses to adults. It may work with a group of children when one child wants the gum that you're chewing on, but it doesn't work with adults. And I feel that this was indicative of how much Legault's wealth insulates him from the reality on the ground. But it also is a very clear indication of how little he cares about Quebec's most vulnerable. I mean, communities of color and religious minorities in Quebec have been aware of this from the get-go with what's gone on with Bill 21 and with Legault's sort of dismissive, practically poo-pooing attitude when it comes to racial profiling and systemic issues in our healthcare system with the death of Joyce Echequan. But I feel like this is one response that truly outed him as frankly a monster. I mean,
Yeah.
It's not difficult to say that what happened to this guy is a tragedy, and he couldn't bring himself to respond with any degree of at least false sincerity, false compassion, and I think that was extremely telling.
It's like he doubled down, and he even made a crack at even though it was the Parti Québécois, the Liberal Party, and Quebec Solidaire. How do you get those guys to agree on anything? But they agreed on this one thing. And Valerie Plante, but of course he decided to pick on Plante, and he's made a comment. He's like, "Oh, I guess she doesn't trust the police." And the second time he came up again, he said, "I trust the SPVM."
It's interesting because I believe it was every news source within a couple of days of Legault making this remark, they came out with a report that fines to homeless people have actually increased a huge amount over 30 years. And what this basically amounts to is a poor tax. It is punishing people who don't have homes. And as much as it kills me to admit it, Legault does have a point when he points the finger at Valerie Plante, but not for the reason people think. And it was actually a friend of mine who pointed this out, that Valerie Plante to a certain degree is complicit in the exacerbating of the homeless problem by agreeing to what basically came down to the liquidating and bulldozing of the homeless encampment on Notre Dame. Because what was this? Who was living there? It was the homeless. It was people who lost their jobs and who were evicted from their homes because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was giving Montreal's homeless population a sense of agency, a sense of community, a sense of autonomy that they themselves said they would never get in shelters. And instead of speaking to them about what would really work for them, they said, "Oh, no, don't worry, we'll send you to a shelter." When interviews with people who lived in those encampments were saying, "We don't want to go to a shelter because we feel like the requirements are violating our rights and our dignity as human beings." And so what happened? There was one fire, and Valerie Plante looked at this as an opportunity to get rid of that encampment, which, if you're, as much as it kills me, think of it from a rich person's perspective. It's not the prettiest thing to look at. Yeah. It's an indication of how much a city has failed its citizens. And to me, that's what was really going on when Plante decided to liquidate it.
Well, yeah, she didn't the right cops.
He's right in terms of pointing to her hypocrisy, but not for the reason he is claiming.
No, his reason is that basically, like, I'm sure he was all for breaking up that sending in the cops to that homeless encampment too. Like, I mean, he doesn't even live in Montreal, but like he like I see, I saw them the whole summer. Like, even there were some people by tenting with tents on the Lachine Canal. Near St. Henry. Like, I went for a drink in the park, and there was like some guy with a tent right behind the tree. I was like, oh, okay, that's different. And they came out, they said hi, like, and they chatted, and then we went off. And yeah, yeah. So, but the thing is, Legault is not just like, he's also like, he seems to be obsessed with the police. In fact, we talked about this last week on FTB Fridays, is when the Montreal suggested an anti-racism commissioner. He was disappointed that it was someone who opposed Bill 21, and he apparently was hoping it was someone from the SPVM that would be appointed.
Well, I'm sorry. The reason why I laugh is because I'm sure most people know the meaning of the word chutzpah. All right, it's the Yiddish term for gall, right? And I'm sort of smiling because didn't he name to the provincial government as Indigenous, as I don't know if it was Minister of Indigenous Affairs or was some kind of high up position.
Ian Lafreniere, right?
He named a former member of the SPVM.
Ian Lafreniere.
The word chutzpah, because Indigenous leaders were justifiably outraged by this, because there is a long-standing history of hostility between Quebec's Indigenous populations and the police, who are often, frankly, there to enforce white colonial secular interests without any care to Indigenous customs, Indigenous culture, and the history of oppression that they've dealt with, which requires a modicum of sensitivity. So to name a member of the SPVM to a position directly dealing with Indigenous communities, it seems like the antithesis of the goals of healing and reconciliation, which our governments claim to want. And yet every time they're given an opportunity to do something good, they do the opposite. As if, like children, like usually if I do for one, I'll do for the other one, they want to play opposite day.
Yeah, it's like, it is paternalistic. They maybe he sees everyone in the province as children, like, except for the people in his government and his supporters.
I'm smiling at you saying he sees the government as children, because it seems like the one group that Legault is determined to not support are people with children. Every single scientific study right now is pointing out that children are key to the spread of the COVID pandemic, of the COVID-19 virus. And he seems to be willfully ignoring it in every turn. In fact, there is a court case before the courts right now being represented by some parents being represented by a well-known human rights lawyer, arguing that they should have the choice. And as much as it kills me to admit this, Doug Ford in Ontario has it right, because they made it 100% the parents' choice. Legault claims to be a capitalist. I mean, he founded Air Transat and all this. He was their CEO for a long time. And yet he is refusing parents the one choice that they are saying they need to get through this pandemic with their sanity intact. And one of the arguments that he has presented is that it's too difficult to offer online schooling and in-person schooling at the same time. And let me be among the many to call BS. I don't have children, but I have many friends who do. I have many family members who do. And what they've been telling me is that whenever they have a COVID outbreak in a given class, they switch immediately to online learning. If it were so difficult to make that switch, they wouldn't be able to do it with such speed and efficiency. So his arguments are bunk. And the consensus is among working aged adults with children is that Legault's real goal is to deny parents a very legitimate excuse of childcare to force them back to work at on-site jobs.
Yeah, it's because he wants. I mean, it's like a nine. I think someone, I can't remember who said, but like basically the 9 to 5 economy. And that's what he cares about. He wants to keep that because kids are back in school, but we have a curfew. Like, we can't go out at like after 8 o'clock at night. But like it's seems like one thing doesn't really match with the other. Like,
it's not just that, but I sort of smile to myself because Legault is part of the baby boomer generation. He fits that demographic. And what do we hear from our parents all the time? That we're not having kids. Well, how in the world are we supposed to be giving them grandkids when the government is offering us zero support to have them? You know, times of crises are a time when governments are truly tested. And when it comes to people in a position to give Legault's generation the grandkids they so desperately want, they're not making it worth our while. There is no support for working parents out there. Everybody I've spoken to with young children is telling me that they feel like they're beating their heads against a wall and that the government is simply not listening.
Yeah. Do you think there's any way? Because I mean, obviously, opposition parties, the mayor, people complaining, and people calling him out, the federal government, that hasn't worked. He seems to double down. I mean,
Well, he
is there
doesn't
any?
care about the federal government. I mean, he told
Yeah,
Trudeau to his face, "You're not your father." That's a guy who truly doesn't care
yeah.
what,
But
what Trudeau
is there
thinks.
any? I'm saying if that doesn't work, if there is there any way, do you think, to get him to change at least this ban on the there's the stance on the exemption for the homeless before the curfew's over? Do you think there's any way to get him to change?
A no confidence vote in the National Assembly. That's what I think it's going to take.
Can they do that when he has a majority?
That's the thing. The question, I would be soliciting members of his party to seeing if all of them actually agree,
Huh.
because I know that party discipline can only take somebody so far. A
Yeah.
really clever politician doing some networking may find, for example, a member of Legault's party who maybe has a couple of school-aged children and who is infuriated by the exemption, unless Legault quietly wrote them an exemption, which frankly wouldn't surprise me, because a lot of people don't know that I actually looked up the requirements. And the requirements are that either the child themselves or one of the plush, meaning an immediate family member, has to be immune compromised, and it requires a doctor's note. Because being disabled and immune compromised, I speak to doctors all the time, and what they tell me, doctors, nurses, time and time again, is that they don't have the time to write these doctor's notes, because it's truly an all hands on deck situation. You have doctors with zero experience dealing with the pandemic who are being enlisted to work in the hospitals dealing with it. Okay, they don't have the time to write the doctor's notes, and it also blatantly ignores the reality of various cultural communities, especially with the housing crisis in our cities. Okay, and I'll give you a good example. Growing up, okay, my mother's family were coming from the Philippines, which means aunts, uncles, cousins were all living under the same roof with me and my siblings. Okay, had the pandemic happened during my childhood, even if all my aunts, uncles, and cousins who were living under the same roof were immune compromised, my siblings and I would still not be exempt from online schooling and could be at risk of passing the virus on to my aunts, uncles, etc. And so I say that it's not only insensitive to people with children, but it's also racist, because it ignores the reality that so many cultural communities, rather than leave them homeless, look after their own and shelter under the same roof.
Yeah. That's yeah. Well, I mean, this is like, I mean, one thing too is like, Legault is also not represented a lot by Montreal. He only has 2 representatives on the island. Now, we did talk about this last week. Before we finish up here, we did mention this last week. Last week we talked about municipal politics. I had now Ricardo on, but you wanted to speak about a new candidate we have for mayor, the first declared candidate against Valerie Plante.
Oh yeah, it's a fellow named Jolicoeur, and I sort of smile to myself because he is presenting himself as a diversity candidate, but he's a white male. And I sort of giggle because there is something inherently paternalistic. Like, who is this guy trying to fool, number one? And number two, I looked at his CV a little bit, and the more I saw, the less I liked. Because the people he's worked for in the past include our very corrupt ex-mayor Tremblay and Pauline Marois, whose racism was too much even for her own party. And I think that speaks volumes about a guy who is claiming to be a diversity candidate and who wants to have more diversity in City Hall. It's another thing that I would frankly call chutzpah. If I rolled my eyes any further when I saw that he announced his candidacy, I would probably make myself dizzy enough to pass out. So
Yeah.
I sort of smile, and I'm hoping that, we were chatting a little bit before this video, that he's going to be a non-factor, because I find his candidacy comedic in its ridiculousness.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Montreal is a party system, though. I mean, we're not as bad as the States, where it's a 2-party system, and like it takes a Mike Bloomberg, a billionaire, basically to actually win as an independent in New York.
Didn't succeed that well.
No, but he actually became mayor as an independent.
That's
But as far, or Chicago, where basically if you win the Democratic primary for mayor, you're the mayor. Like you become the mayor. But we still have a party system. I mean, yes, there are independent candidates for mayor, but they don't have the name recognition and they don't have the whole party machine to give them that level. So also he's running as the diversity candidate, but he clearly doesn't have the pedigree for that. So he's not going to appeal to people from diverse communities, but he's also not going to appeal to people who like the establishment. And if Denis Coderre gets back into this, it's just Plante versus Coderre. Like that's
it's gonna be a mess. And the thing, for me, it also for for Jolicoeur, it shows a remarkable level of tone deafness, because it's not like in the States where if an older white guy is running for president and he chooses what amounts to an incredibly competent but nonetheless diversity candidate as his running mate vice president, as you saw with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, you're satisfying everyone across the board. It doesn't work like that. We don't have a situation in Montreal where you see a deputy mayor and think, oh, they're going to be sort of sharing power 50-50. No, it's just the guy or the individual you have in the background in case anything goes awry with the mayor. And as we know, Montreal mayors are notoriously reluctant to give up any kind of authority. So that just wouldn't happen here. So to present himself, without taking a good, long, speculative look in the mirror, introspective look in the mirror, and then present himself as the diversity candidate, makes most diverse communities in Montreal either laugh or roll their eyes. And the sooner he realizes that, the better, especially given his track record.
Yeah, and he's not going to take votes away from establishment candidates either.
Wait.
Yeah, like that's being that. Like, yeah, no. So
Plus I guess he appeals to their worst bases.
Yeah, honestly, I think this election, like we said last week, I think this election is pretty much it's Valerie Plante to win or lose. Like there's not going to be anyone with any name recognition. Like unless we get a Coderre in there, but in which case he's got all of his baggage too.
I know that a lot of people are disappointed with Plante, that she has failed to take a lot of strong stances on things that she said she would. Yeah. As a disabled candidate, I've been quite disappointed. As a disabled,
you're running. Wait, you're running.
No, I'm not running. Good. I don't hate myself enough to run. Let's just get that one out of the way. It's early. It's that Plante has disappointed a lot of people who, her election had given them a lot of hope. As a disabled citizen of Montreal, I've seen my access to, my mobility actually reduced by the way that she's implemented these bike paths, for example. And a lot of disabled citizens see it that way, that it's actually become harder for them to navigate the city since her election. Because, for example, instead of, say, installing removable poles to create barriers for the bike paths, they've installed concrete. They've installed these concrete barriers, which from a perspective of a disabled person, if you are, say, taking a cab or whatever to help you get your groceries, makes it very difficult to get the car as close to your home as possible to bring your stuff up. It's little things like that may seem like no big deal, but it can turn a simple flight of stairs into Mount Everest if you are struggling like I am with the ability to walk on certain days.
Yeah. Okay. That's obviously to people see. I mean, it also depends. Like for me, like there were certain things that disappointed me about. I volunteered on the Plante campaign. There's some people who things that disappointed me about her, but for me, like I'm looking like what is the alternative, and especially if Coderre comes back, I don't want that. And if this guy is running, like I don't want him. So I don't know.
Another thing that disappointed a lot of people with Plante is what I consider to be a frankly cowardly status on Bill 21. That she said, "Oh, I don't like it." But I'm going to enforce it anyway. How can you be the mayor of the most ethnically and religiously diverse city in Montreal and say something like that? I think it was cowardly. And I believe it was, and I remember talking, I recently had a discussion, Valerie Plante claims to be a feminist, but she wouldn't back Sue Montgomery in that whole scandal involving her chief of staff. She wouldn't back another woman up. She's taken a lot of stances that came off as either weak and cowardly or, politically expedient to the point of laziness. And I feel like in that regard, she's failed a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's I see that. For me, it's a matter of like I think that she had a lot of failings, and I think that she's actually gonna I think she might make I think this year she's like, admittedly it's an election year. I think she's trying to make up for some of those failings this year.
But to make
is it too late? Is it
things during an election year is the kind of thing that minorities see right through.
Yeah.
Oh, you want our vote, so you're doing the good stuff now. Really?
Yeah. Well, I guess municipal politics. Well, at least we were both in complete agreement that François Legault has got to go.
He has got to go because it has gone past the point of willful blindness and ignorance. And I feel like his wealth, his privilege, his ethnicity has willfully blinded him to the reality on the ground. And it is Quebec's most vulnerable. It is working families who have suffered. And it frustrates me because I speak to a lot of people of his generation who think the job that he's doing is just dandy. And, you know, if you sort of get the feel for people, say, under 50 on social media, we all feel like we're banging our heads against a brick wall because nothing we are doing is forcing the government to listen. And I get that he didn't get that many votes in Montreal, but I'm sure there are people across the province who are still wondering, for example, why the schools are still open. He said just recently that he's going to extend the curfew through to February because the curfew seems to be working, but they're expecting a spike. Well, if the curfew's working, then why are you expecting a big uptick in cases? Oh, could it be because the schools are still open? Because the schools were open 2 weeks ago? The obvious is screaming him in the face, and Legault is literally going, la, 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 la. And I know that that's an infantile gesture to do on this on this video.
FTB Fridays.
So is saying in a press conference when you are the head of a province that, oh, if we give an exception to the homeless, we have to give everybody an exception because people will be faking.
Yeah, like who? Honestly, no one's going to pretend.
Works with children.
Yeah, no one's going to pretend to be homeless. Like, I'm sorry, that's nobody cares that much about going for a walk at 8 o'clock a day. Anyways, we were in agreement on that one. Thank you for joining us. So you can follow Samantha Gold Artist on Facebook, right?
Yep. www.facebook.com/SamIamArt. I am also participating in an exhibition to raise awareness for mental health called Coup de Pinceau, Coup de Ciseaux. It is a virtual exhibition. Oh, yeah. And I'm also participating in Festival de la Veille Noire, which is premiering in February. So there'll be more on that.
Yeah, we'll cover that. And you can also read you on Forget the Box. And you can follow me on Twitter at Jason C. McLean. And of course, with this video, you can give us a like and a share and a follow on YouTube. Share it on Facebook as well, too. And of course, for daily content, you can follow us on forgetthebox.net. We'll see you next week for another FTB Fridays.